welcome everybody. I'm really pleased to be here and present this talk to you about what we're doing at Somme. So a little breakdown of the talk. The first part's going to be some background, what are the Somme Preserves and how did they get there? In the second part, we're going to take a look at, what do we as stewards do to kind of take care of the nature that's found there. In the third part, we'll look a little bit at, how do we know that it's working? What do we look at to know that it's working? And then in the fourth part, I hope in part 3, I'll convince you that it is working, and we'll take a look at what that kind of entails. So, what are the Somme Preserves? They're a series of 4 Cook County forest preserves that are kind of strung out along Dundee Road here. And on their north border, they kind of have the Eden Spur, and they're kind of bisected by Waukegan Road. And so these 4 preserves are Somme Prairie, Somme Prairie Grove, Somme Woods, and then south of Somme Woods, we've got this little tongue that sticks out here. It's aptly named Somme Woods South. These were purchased by the forest preserves between the 1920s and 30s, and they're named after a major battle that occurred during World War I along the Somme River in France. All right, so that's what Somme looks like roughly today. But this is what Somme looked like 25,000 years ago. Like most of Northeast Illinois, it was under a huge sheet of glacial ice. Yeah, so these glaciers had a huge effect on the nature that came to be in Illinois after they left. And so this is a map of what are called moraines, which are these little ridges that as the glaciers retreated, wherever they kind of stopped for a period of time, they would deposit sediment and rocks and different things like that, and they would build up these ridges. And so those are called moraines. And in the most recent glaciation event, which ended about 11,000 years ago, there are a series of 4 moraines that occurred close to the current border of Lake Michigan today. And Somme is found on one of these, the Deerfield Moraine, which is named after the town of Deerfield. In between these moraines, there are these kind of valleys that can be quite big, and this is where the glacier stood for long periods of time. And the land there is very flat, and it tends not to drain very well in a lot of places. So this gave rise to a lot of wetlands, a lot of marshes, and stuff like that. So Somme is up here on the Deerfield Moraine, and the footprint of the preserves actually take in part of this valley in between the 2 moraines, the Park Ridge and the Deerfield Moraine. Then the preserves go up and over the moraine and come back and take in a little bit of the valley in between that, the Deerfield Moraine and the one over. And so after the glaciers kind of retreated, the first ecosystems that followed in their wake were Arctic tundra and spruce forest. These are things that we associate now with the far north. This was the time of woolly mammoths and stuff, but as the climate warmed and dried, new ecosystems started to enter into Illinois and became the dominant ecosystems. And these were prairies, grasslands, and oak ecosystems, oak woodlands and savannas, and their associated wetlands. And the thing that these ecosystems all have in common is that they're very, very dependent on fire. It's not that they tolerate fire, it's that they really need it to persist and survive and be healthy. In their deep evolutionary history, these fires in a drier part of the Earth's history millions of years ago would have been started by natural phenomena, like lightning or something like that. But in the last tens of thousands of years, as human beings have been on this continent, they were increasingly started by people on purpose. And this became a very sophisticated practice by the last couple of thousand years for sure, and it had drastic impacts on the land. And these fires were huge in extent. They could range for miles and burn for days, kind of like what's happening in Texas right now. And this was a very important part of the landscape and very important for the nature that survived there, as well as for the indigenous people that used this. And it was part of a very sophisticated cultural practice. Okay, so why am I telling you guys all this? Well, this had these 2 factors, the glaciers and the fire, and really influenced the way that the ecosystems are distributed at Somme. So at the time of the year when these fires were being lit was late fall or early winter, and the prevailing winds are coming out of the west, right? So they could drive these prairies eastward in these little valleys where the land was very flat. There was nothing to obstruct these fires, right? And so they could come through in these huge fires like what we saw in the painting before, 40-foot flames, 50-foot flames, and really just tear through with serious intensity. And prairie tended to inhabit in these places because of the severity of the fire. But then things start to change a little bit once you go uphill. This is the moraine, and the ridge is kind of getting higher. You're kind of going uphill. And so the fire is still quite intense because it can travel very well uphill. But once it gets to the top of the moraine and starts going downhill, then the severity decreases significantly. The fire would still be able to pass through here, but because it wasn't as severe, it allowed trees and wooded ecosystems to form much more readily. And so that's why we find oak woodland on the eastern side of the moraine and prairie on the western side in the lowland. And then in between there was this kind of tension zone, which is called savanna, and it's a sparsely treed ecosystem. If you're thinking of the Serengeti, it's very much like that. We used to have things quite like the Serengeti here in North America. All right, so I think we kind of have a general sense of what these ecosystems are, but I think it bears going a little bit more in depth so we can all understand them a little bit better. The type of prairie that we have at Somme is called black soil prairie, and that's very simply named that because of the thick black soil that would form underneath these prairies. As the prairie plants each year died, their roots would die, partially die, and then come back, and they would leave lots of organic matter, and these wonderful, rich, organic, loamy soils would build up. And they were obviously very good for farming. You could grow just about anything in them. So that means that out of 22 million acres or so of prairie that existed, maybe in the 1820s, today there are, or in 1976, when people systematically started to look for them, there was only about 2,000 acres left. And of those 2,000 acres, only about 54 are what are called grade A prairie, or the most mature, old growth expression of a prairie. And these photos here, these three photos, are all pictures of grade A prairies. Now we call them the tall grass prairie, and I think that kind of lends itself to us thinking that they're fields filled with tall grass and not much else. But as we can see here in these grade A prairies, which would have been extremely common out of these 22 million acres, they would have been, perhaps most of them would have looked like this. Most of the vegetation never really gets above your waist. And it's not just grass growing in, right? It's a very diverse set of plants, many, many plants, and they're growing together in these very complex ways, one on top of the other. Kind of looks chaotic, but it's a kind of organized chaos. There's an internal logic to how that works. And they can be very beautiful, as we can see in all of these photos. And I couldn't help resist including this kind of artist rendering of what one might have looked like in 1491. And I think of this as I sit and look over Somme Prairie from Somme Prairie Grove. Okay, and so Somme is special because it has this gradient from prairie through oak, savanna, and into woodland, which is not really captured very often in our preserve system. But it's also special, perhaps primarily so, because out of those 54 acres of grade A prairie, there's 2 acres that occur at Somme, within Somme Prairie. And so this is a very high priority for stewardship and restoration. These are irreplaceable places, and they deserve the highest level of care that we can provide them. And we can really see how beautiful it actually is. All right, so the one of the other main ecosystem types of Somme and of all of Illinois is bur oak savanna. And, you know, prairie is extremely rare, but in 1970s, when they did this survey, they found 0 acres of grade A bur oak savanna. So this is even rarer than prairie, although it's a little bit more complicated than that, but we're not going to get into that today. What does it look like? I mean, these photos kind of give you a sense of what the structure of the community is like. It's like these plains, like we said, open grasslands with kind of scattered trees throughout them, and they grow in clumps or singly or here and there in these kind of shifting mosaics of grassland and woodland. And a lot of the plants, I mean, all of the prairie plants are also savanna plants, but it turns out that there are specialist plants that are uniquely suited to living in these dynamic mosaics with the shifting patterns of sunlight, and also animals too that respond uniquely to this sort of a community structure. The main tree that would have been on these savannas is the bur oak, and this is because this is one of the most fire resistant trees that are in our flora, certainly in the Midwest, and perhaps in all of North America. They can live for decades, just as these little grubs, kind of, is what they're called. And what they are is just root systems that every year, once the top of the plant gets killed off, they keep sending shoots up the next year. And they can live like that for decades, but if they get a chance, they get to grow up and they can become these enormous, spreading, magnificent trees with these thick branches on their lower limbs. And their cork, the bark is very corky, so this provides it an extra layer of fire protection. So these are the only trees that could really withstand this harsh environment with the wind constantly blowing across the plain and these fires that would come on an annual basis historically. And then we have woodland, and I'm going to sound like a broken record here, but it's possible that oak woodland, at least in this old growth form, this grade A mature expression of what an oak woodland is even rarer than bur oak savanna. In fact, in our region, there's only one example that we know of, and it doesn't even occur in Illinois. It actually occurs in southeastern Wisconsin at this place called Army Lake. These communities are woodland communities. They're oak woodland. They're dominated by oaks, principally white oak in the uplands, although it can vary a lot depending on the different situations in which you're in. We can see here, these photos are all from Army Lake, from this really fantastic, wonderful place. And we can see that, even though it's a woodland setting, and the canopy is closed, all of the trees are widely spaced apart, and they have these wide spreading branches down here that are all healthy and have leaves on them, so they're photosynthesizing. And even though there's a closed canopy, typically, there's still a lot of light that gets to the floor of the woodland. And what's growing underneath the trees is not a bunch of brush, or it's not very brushy typically. It's this very low growing turf. It kind of looks like a very messy lawn, filled with wildflowers, as we can see here. And this is a close-up of what that turf looks like. And just like in a prairie, we can see in this healthy woodland, there could be up to 30 or 40 species, depending on which part of the Midwest you're in, per square meter of plants. And then every time we think about plant species, we also have to think there are maybe up to 10 associated insects that those plant species are supporting. So this is a lot of diversity that's packed into these, in a very small area. And meter for meter, these ecosystems can have more diversity than than in a tropical rainforest or something. And but on a landscape scale, maybe that's not the case. But all three of these ecosystems are all globally imperiled ecosystems. They don't exist really almost at all anymore. And so caring for them and trying to bring them back and trying to keep them healthy is a high priority for conservation. But it's not just any plant that can kind of live in these turfs, these really old growth, mature expressions of what all these ecosystems are. It's very specific plants that can do that. And to illustrate this idea, I thought I'd share this really nice quote, which is a little bit long here, but that's all right. From H.S. Bapoon, who was a famous botanist in our region and who taught for a long time at Lakeview High School in the early 20th century. And so he grew up out on a farm in northwest Illinois, and there was a woods there that he really loved exploring as a kid. And he says, "My mouth waters as I think of those days. The rich woods were full of red baneberry and blue cohosh and May apples, spikenard, ginseng, etc., etc., etc. Not one of these plants, though, is found on the farm today." And then he goes on to say that in the woods with thin soil, there were all these other plants. And then in sloughs, they were filled with lilies and all of this stuff. And just all of these plants are gone. I had a list in 1876 that had 355 plants, and today there are barely 200. And these are the plebeians and toughs, the tramps and rabble of the plant world. The royal ones are all missing. And so I thought that was a really nice way to kind of explain this concept of the coefficient of conservatism, which, people had kind of understood this about plants, that there are some plants that are just kind of weedy, and then there are some that you only find in these very special situations. And this was formalized beginning in the 1970s by Jerry Wilhelm and Floyd Swink, then of the Morton Arboretum. And what this coefficient of conservatism does, or the C value, is it gives these native plants a rank on a scale from 0 to 10 that assesses their fidelity to high-quality ecosystems like remnant prairies. So if you're a C equals 0, you're kind of in the weedy zone, these tramps that Bapoon is talking about, and you thrive in these places that the soil is getting disturbed or something like that. On the other hand, if you're a C10 species, you're kind of rare, but not because those plants themselves are rare, but the places, the habitat that they inhabit are rare. They're like the princess and the pea, right? They're very specific about what their habitat requirements are, and they are only found in prime habitat. And so this was kind of a huge advance in our ability to conceptualize and understand ecosystems. And it became the basis of what's called the floristic quality assessment, which is a way of measuring ecosystem health as it's reflected by its plants. So putting some faces to the names, what are these plebs that Bapoon is talking about? Well, things like common milkweed is a great plant for pollinators. But for plant nerds, it's not really a very exciting plant. I mean, you can find it growing anywhere. Doesn't mean it's not a good plant, it just means that it grows in weedy places, roadsides, railroad ballast, old fields, gardens, things like that. Same thing with daisy fleabane, with Canada goldenrod. These are all things that are not really fussy about where they're growing, right? And they can grow by themselves, they can grow with other natives, they can grow with non-natives, they don't really care. The only place they don't grow is in these mature expressions of ecosystem. And then on the other side, you have things like Mead's milkweed. Not all milkweeds live up to this weed that they have in the name. This is one of the rarest plants in Illinois. It's a federally endangered species. And you can only find it growing in remnant prairies, more or less. Eastern prairie white-fringed orchid, I think people are often surprised to know that we have many species of orchids that are native to our landscape, to our native ecosystems. And they're very particular, though, about where they grow. There's another federally endangered species. Red baneberry, this plant that Bapoon is talking about, I kind of got it at a bad time in this photo here. It just went from flowered, and it's going to make these brilliant red fruits. But when it's not in flower or fruiting, it's a very unremarkable plant, just a bunch of leaves, very easy to overlook. not very showy at all. So this C value is not, again, about whether a plant is beautiful or whether it's unique or rare. Specifically, it's about where it likes to grow. And it likes to grow in these very high quality environments. So Papoon's essay was called Destruction of the Farm Flora. And for him, what that meant was that after his family moved out, the farmers came after him. They cut all the trees down and then the woods died. And I think that, for him at his time certainly, and I think to a large extent today, we mostly think of nature losses happening as this horrible action, the hand of man is spreading out and destroying nature directly. And that's definitely happening, especially in many other parts of the world. And even still in our part of the world here, as evidenced just a year ago by the very shameful partial destruction of Belleville Prairie, which is another part of that grade A, those grade A prairie acres. But that's not really the major way in which we're losing biodiversity here today. The major way is through ecological degradation. And a lot of that is, a consequence of development, of fragmentation of the landscape and all these things, pollution, etc. But fundamentally what it is a shift in the community away from these old growth, mature expressions towards simpler ecosystems, very simplified ones, where you lose a lot of those species and you lose the associations that work between them, that allow them to be these old growth things that are, if you treat them right, they can be persistent almost indefinitely. And so ecological restoration is trying to push that back, trying to maintain these old growth ecosystems and trying to emulate them as much as possible. So trying to restore these associations that allow the biological system to be self-perpetuating and obviously a little bit more beautiful, I think, from our perspective. And this is kind of captured really nicely in this graph. This comes from Justin Thomas, a botanist with the Nature Conservancy down in Missouri. Up here, what it has is on the x-axis, we've got C value, mean C value. That's just the average C value if you took a random plot in this ecosystem. And on the y-axis, we've got number of species. And so in a mature ecosystem, you've got these really high C value species, these conservative species. And you have a lot of them, and they're all growing together, one on top of the other in this organized chaos, right? But then if something happens, some catastrophe comes along, like the bison wallow might have been one way that this happened historically, you go back to square zero. You get bare dirt, and that's not what these conservative plants like, right? And so that bare dirt fills in with weeds, and it starts filling in with more and more weeds, so you start getting more and more species, but their C value is very low, right? And then at some point you reach a tipping point in which you're getting a lot of kind of mid-conservative species, these species that make the matrix in which other species can thrive. It creates new niches. And as you're doing that, all these weeds start to drop out. So you're losing species, but the C value continues to increase, right? And then at some point, there's another shift, and the really rare conservative species that really don't like disturbance start coming back in. And you get back to this old growth system. And so, in the past, when our landscape was healthy overall, there was, it had great degree of integrity. This bison wallow that we're talking about, there's all this prairie surrounding it, and constantly there's seeds going in and animals bringing these seeds in there that no longer are around. But our landscapes don't function this way anymore. Right now it's kind of like think of these weeds as scabs. They're covering a wound on your skin. And eventually the skin heals over. But today, the situation is kind of reversed. We're living in a world of scabs, and there's nothing to heal over. So restoration is trying to facilitate this process, this maturation in a landscape that can no longer do it by itself. So how exactly do we do that? Well, the first place we start out is to check out the history of the site that we're working at. This is an aerial from 1938 of Somme. Here's Dundee Road, here's Waukegan. Spur doesn't exist yet. And what we can see right away from this photo is that there's not a lot of trees here. And in fact, not only that, but these are, most of these preserves, this is Somme Prairie and Somme Prairie Grove over here, are farms. And much of Somme Woods on the east half is also, on the west half is also farms. And so what does that tell us? Well, that means that if you go to those places, you can't expect to find any of these conservative species there, right? Because this is like ground zero of disturbance. This is a plowed field. And so there's nothing. If you let that thing alone, there isn't really going to be anything coming back, any of those conservative species that are left there to come back. Some of them might have survived in little edges like this what do you call it, fence line here. But for the most part, a lot of the conservative species are gone, and if you left it alone, you'd just come up with weeds. On the east half, we have the woods, and we can see that the woods, at least as far as the trees are going, are pretty intact, right? And so you might think from that, well, okay, they didn't cut down all the trees, so that's good, so things must be going good underneath the trees. But we know from interviewing the previous owners of the land before the Forest Preserves bought them, that the farmers grazed these woods. They used them for pasture. And so much like plowing, our native ecosystems didn't co-evolve with this really intensive grazing that's part of European agriculture. And so all the conservative species died out here too, for the most part. Okay, where are we going from there? Oh yeah. Oh, and then I should say, after the Forest Preserves bought the land, the thinking of the time was, well, people are bad, people are not nature. Nature is what happens when people are not there, right? And so, people do things like farm and cut down trees and burn, because the fires, of course, are not natural. So they just very much tried to prevent fires from happening wherever they could. And in certain places, to try to make things a little bit more natural, make things a little bit less weedy, like an old field, they planted trees. That was just, how people thought about nature at the time, and our views have obviously evolved. So the consequence of that, I kind of gave it away a little bit, is that this is what things look like after many decades. With the plowing and the grazing, the ecosystems got very weakened. Their conservative species were gone, for the most part. And then with fire suppression, even fewer of them were gone. And the only thing, this made a lot of opportunity for brush to get established, and then finally invasive species like buckthorn, like what we have here. And the keystone species of these ecosystems, like these oaks, were all gone, or can die out, because they're not reproducing in this very dense, dark, shadowy thing. Compare this with that photo from Army Lake, right? There's nothing growing underneath here except for little seedlings of this buckthorn. And then this neglect that the outcome was that these spaces look kind of neglected, right? They're not beautiful, they're not inspiring. And so people think these are just neglected spaces, and that's, the consequence of that is that people think, oh yeah, these are neglected spaces and I can do whatever I want in them. I can dump my trash in them, or in the case of this place, which is called the party spot, euphemistically by the stewards, doesn't look like this anymore. This is where kids used to come and hang out and do bad things that they weren't supposed to do, or not get seen by it. So that's the consequence of not participating in the ecosystem. But people kind of started figuring this out decades ago. And we live in a part of the world, in this region in Chicago, that has a very deep environmental history and grassroots environmental history. The Forest Preserves, they started when a bunch of people got into a room and said, well, we've got to do something about this, because if we don't buy up some of this land, we're going to lose it and all the nature on it. And from the very get-go, forest preserves were this wonderful institution with a very long-term view of things. But the next chapter in that story, what started on August 6, 1977, with the birth of the North Branch Prairie Project, and kind of inspired by a lot of other ecologists that were, and popularizers of nature that were working at that time. Their goal was to try to save these prairies that were being lost to brush and neglect and all that occurred along the North Branch Prairie, along the North Branch of the Chicago River in the Cook County Forest Reserves. And I don't have time to really give the full history, but if you've never read it, there's this book, Miracle Under the Oaks, that kind of explains a lot of it. Many other people have covered it, and it's really fascinating to hear, but we don't have time to get into that today. The main thing that I want to say about this is that it kind of started a movement of volunteer restoration, and it really got it going in our region. And the North Branch Prairie Project, or the North Branch Restoration Project, as it's now known, is still around today and going strong. And we at Somme are very proud to be part of this group, which has been going now for decades. And what do I want to say at this point? Anyway. Yes, that's what I wanted to say. The kind of the spirit behind it was that that this would be trying to restore these old growth ecosystems and try to keep them and emulate them as much as possible. And so that very much is still at the core of how we're thinking about what restoration is. So over the decades, working together with the forest preserves through the mentorship from staff and from other experts, and through trial and error, volunteer stewards with the North Branch Restoration Project have developed a kind of suite of management skills and a lot of know-how around how to get this stuff done. And some of that I'll show you guys today. So probably the thing that volunteer restoration is most associated with is cutting brush. And it's a very important first step and a very, very fun time. If you've ever done it, it's kind of like gives you an excuse to get out into the winter, in the Chicago winter, which you don't have a lot of. And you get to see the results of your work. There's a bunch of brush, and then at the end of the day, it's gone. You get to be around these wonderful bonfires with people and, cook things and all that. And so it's a very important first step, because with the lack of fire, our ecosystems have gotten very brushy. But this isn't really, cutting buckthorn isn't really what volunteer restoration is about. It's the first step, right? But fundamentally, we're about trying to manage out of balance species, of which buckthorn is just one. That can be both non-native species like buckthorn and also native species. In fact, out of these 6 pictures, there's only 2 of them that are dealing with non-native species. The rest of them are all native species that we've got, that we're trying to manage in these photos here. And this shouldn't really be surprising. This is like cancer, Cancer is your own cells behaving badly. If you've been unhealthy especially, right? And so these landscapes have been unhealthy for such a long time. And it's not surprising that some parts of them have kind of gone out of control. And what we're trying to do to try to facilitate this mature ecosystem, it is, to try to bring some of that balance back so that we can, get to that point where things are self-sustainable and everything can kind of be in balance. And this isn't just plants, it also extends to animals, and especially white-tailed deer. We love white-tailed deer. They're cute, fuzzy, wonderful parts of the ecosystem. Well, yeah, I like deer. I like coming across them. But there's just too many of them. In the absence of the natural predation and hunting pressures that they would have had throughout their history, throughout evolutionary history, there's just way too many deer today. And here's, 5 of them, but I've seen up to 14 of them at a time in the preserves. And so that's not really sustainable for the size of our preserves. A lot of these, rare species, plant species that we're trying to bring back, and the insects and all the animals that are associated with them in the soil biota, we're not giving them a chance if we don't do something about the deer, right? And so one of the major things that we volunteers do is cage, and some of us spend a lot of time putting cages to protect some very important species and kind of give them a chance to make fruit, flower and make fruit each year. Because otherwise they would just get eaten down. And I'm happy to report that if you do this for long enough, for most species so far, and hopefully all of them in the future that need this kind of help, they can kind of graduate out of this intensive care stage, and then they don't really need this sort of help anymore. So hopefully that happens soon. But we also advocate for deer control, and this is really important, and for many reasons, but for us as stewards, this is the main one. And it also includes trees. We cut a lot of trees down. There are way too many trees in our woods and in our savannas. And again, this is like cancer, right? These are native trees for the most part. And a lot of people kind of get upset sometimes when we tell them we're going to cut native trees. But the fact is that none of us really want to cut down trees. We like trees. We really like trees. We're environmentalists, right? But we're not giving a chance to those things that should be growing. That should be growing underneath these oaks that have got all of these little trees growing underneath them, and the shade that they create doesn't permit those species to come back. And so we have to do something about it. But we're not really motivated by destroying things. We're really motivated by restoring things. And in this degraded landscape that we've got at Somme, that really means bringing back things by seeds, because these seeds don't really get around a lot by themselves, and we've lost lots of species through, as we've seen from the history of the site. We spend thousands of hours collectively gathering these seeds, cleaning them, organizing them, mixing them, and then broadcasting them out into the ecosystem. And this means we generate about several hundred gallons each year of seed mixes that feature something upwards of 350 species of plants. If you try to put a dollar value on that, it would probably run into the tens of thousands of dollars if you bought it from a nursery. But the thing is that many of these species are not being grown in nurseries. You can't buy the seeds of them. And the other thing is that these seeds are all local ecotype seeds. So in the early days of the North Branch, the idea was that seeds would be gathered from these kind of ecosystem remnants that were dying out, these little areas that were not really big enough to get preserved, areas along railroads or tucked behind a warehouse, or in the preserve systems with landowner permission. And then they would get brought back to the North Branch preserves that were getting cared for. And in that place, all of these plant species that had kind of scattered to the winds would have a chance to come back in one place and start continuing their journey of evolution that kind of the fragmentation of the landscape had prohibited, had put a stop to. And so because of that investment in seeds decades ago, we're able to collect the vast majority, almost all of the seeds that we see here from the preserves themselves. But because these are local ecotype seeds, I said it was about in the tens of thousands of dollars range if you wanted to buy these seeds. The actual value probably would run an order of magnitude more than that, because you have to go and wild harvest these seeds. And that means paying people to go and do it. So it would be way, way more expensive if you were going to try to do it like that. And we think this is something, one of the main areas of value that volunteers can bring to the Cook County Forest Preserves. So a lot of people kind of say, why bother? Why don't you just, it's not natural what you're doing, gathering all of these seeds and then going and spreading them out. Why don't you just let the seeds blow around and kind of give them agency and let them do things? Well, we would, because it would be a lot easier to do that, but the thing is that it doesn't work. In these degraded ecosystems, we've got, over decades, there's been a lot of experimentation in that vein, and we found that this is the way that you do it. This is how you start restoring that old growth quality. And over time, you can really get to it, but you really have to provide the seeds. And if you don't do that, you end up with these kind of weedy, not complete ecosystems that don't have that sort of quality. They kind of have an intermediate quality. And you also end up doing round robin with invasive species. You're just managing invasive species, and the disturbance continues, and you're just going around cutting the same brush, pulling the same weeds over and over and over again. Whereas if you plant seeds, you get competition, you get this maturation, and these niches all get filled, and you don't have to do that anymore, and you can move on to the next place. So how do we know that it's working? Well, you can go and take a walk at Somme, and you can tell me whether it's working or not. It's a very beautiful place, most of it, and every year it gets better and better. And so whether you're a plant nerd or a bee nerd or fungi or whatever, a birder, there's stuff to see here, and it's really fantastic and it's really wonderful. But there's more, realistic ways in which things are getting better. But that's a very important one, is that people can come and enjoy the nature there. Somme is home to over dozens of threatened and endangered species, both Illinois and federally endangered species. And not only that, but many of the largest populations of these threatened species occur at Somme, and it's almost certainly in response to the sort of management, the sort of care that stewards are providing that allows their populations to flourish. Birds, I've talked a lot about plants. If you can't tell, I really like plants. And they're kind of foundational in these ecosystems, and that's why we focus a lot on them. But, animals are also making a comeback at Somme too. Before restoration started, none of these birds you couldn't find there. It was not a very good place to look for birds. But as the decades went on and restoration progressed, you can find all of them there, and a lot of them are quite common. Things even like birds of concern in the Chicago region, things like the red-headed woodpecker and the northern flicker, American woodcock, eastern kingbird. These are all open woodland savanna birds that are getting rarer and rarer in our region because the ecosystem structure that they're looking for, they can't really find here. But they're all flourishing in Somme. They nest and breed every year. Probably many people in this audience are aware of the very big brush clearing, tree clearing project that occurred at Somme Prairie done by the post office. And one of the major impetuses for that was to restore grassland bird breeding habitat. Grassland birds had not nested in Somme Prairie, had not been seen in Somme Prairie throughout the entire history of the North Branch. But in the years after those trees were removed, there was enough habitat there that birds felt comfortable returning, and dick thistles were found at Somme Prairie in those years. So that's a really good sign that things are going in the right direction. It also extends to insects. We haven't studied this as much because we don't have a lot of the expertise. We would love to study it more. But in a study last year by the Illinois Natural History Survey, both the rusty patch bumblebee and the southern plains bumblebee, which are respectively on the federally endangered list and about to be on the federally endangered list, were found at Somme. And so it's really a testament to, if you build it, they will come. As you can find way more flowers at Somme than you can anywhere else in the surrounding region. And because volunteers have been around for such a long time, they've been able to study the results over extended periods of time. And this is kind of in contrast with most academic research that happens because the funding cycles are different and people move on, and it's a very different sort of setting. But we're able to study these things over much longer periods of time. And you can see trends that you might not be able to see in those 3 to 5 year periods. And this was published a couple of years ago, 2020, by a few of us in the journal PLS1. And it got a lot of good press. Some prominent environmental publications like Yale E360 did a piece on it, and then in the blogosphere, Dan Carter, who's this really excellent ecologist with the prairie enthusiasts up in Wisconsin, wrote a piece that featured this paper, and he called it "What counts as restoration this does." So that's kind of nice to hear, right? And the crux of the paper is kind of summarized in this graph, and that's that if you do these things that we've been talking about, you control deer, you cut brush, you remove trees that shouldn't be there, you manage invasive species, and you seed, and then burn. Also, I didn't get a chance to talk about burns today, but that's a critical element for all of these ecosystems, as we've heard. Things start to get better over time. And the mean C value went from kind of down here in the 2 region, which is indicative of a disturbed ecosystem, and today it's roughly up here in the 5 region, which is indicative of a high quality ecosystem. But it took decades to get there. It didn't happen in 2 years, it didn't happen in 3 years or 5 years, it took decades to get there. And it took continual effort being put into that. And it kind of looks a lot like this thing that we saw before, right? You start out down here, things don't look so good, and then you get up here to these mature ecosystems. And that's kind of the situation where we're at today. And in recognition of all this work, this was a study that happened at Somme Prairie Grove in a place called Vestal Grove, which is the woodland area of Somme Prairie Grove. Somme Prairie Grove was dedicated by the Cook County Forest Preserves as an Illinois Nature Preserve in 2021. And what this Illinois Nature Preserve status is the highest possible legal protection that can be afforded to a natural area in Illinois. Basically, it's the state saying, and the landowner saying, this land as nature is so important as nature that we are going to keep it as nature in perpetuity. You can't build an airport on it, you can't do this, you can't do that. It's got to stay as nature for people to enjoy, for nature itself, and for scientific study. And so that's kind of a real testament to how things turned around from that photo that we saw of the party spot, right? Imagine that back and forth, right? What happened over time. Somme Prairie, because of those 2 acres of grade A prairie, is already a nature preserve. It has been for decades, since the 1980s, and we're really trying to get Somme Woods to become a nature preserve too. Maybe one day we'll see. So what does it take? Going back to this thing that Dan Carter wrote about the Vestal Grove paper, I really like what he wrote about it, so I thought I'd share it with you guys. He says, killing invasive species is not restoration. Planting trees and prairie plants and burning and volunteer work parties, these are not restoration in and of themselves. It includes some or all of these things, but it really is prolonged stewardship that's based on ambitious and ecologically appropriate goals. And I think Somme is the poster child for that. At the foundation of this work is a long-term partnership between the Cook County Forest Preserves and these volunteers that have taken on a lot of the day-to-day management and decision-making for these sites, and they're trusted to do that by the staff because of this long-term partnership. Neither side could have done it without the other. No agency has the resources to do all the things that they want to do, and volunteers are able to fill in some of those gaps. And in the meantime, volunteers wouldn't have been able to do it without the benefit and of these big institutions that have this long-term vision. They keep supporting that long-term vision, the mission of conservation. And also they wouldn't have been able to do it without the mentorship and the support of the staff throughout all these years. So I hope that this continues long into the future, in fact, indefinitely, because a lot of people liken restoration to building cathedrals. The people that laid the foundations of this cathedral here knew they weren't going to see the end result. And I know today I'm not going to see the end result. And that's partially because there's no such thing as an end result in restoration, right? And if someone tells you that a restoration project has been completed and this place has been restored, you should really kind of give them a weird, funny look, because that's wrong. These are living, evolving, breathing things, ecosystems. And they change and they evolve over time, right? And we're part of that ecosystem too, and we have been for tens of thousands of years on this continent, and we're increasingly starting to understand that. So we can't just pull out and say, job done, and we're gonna let things go. We always have to be involved and take care if we want to keep these spaces alive. And what that means is that you have to have a human community that's kind of parallel alongside this natural community that's being taken care of. And this needs to be a multi-generational effort. So at Somme, we really pay attention to how do we talk with each other? How do we invite new people into this work? How do we share all of this, that what we're doing? Because that's what's going to build this multi-generational effort. And the health of this human community is going to reflect in the health of the natural community. And the health of the natural community is what's going to inspire more people to get involved and be a part of the team. And learning is a central component to that. You know, we have to transmit all the things that we're learning across these generations if we're going to keep this multi-generational effort going. And so we really take this seriously at Somme. We talk a lot with each other. We share what we're thinking, what we're doing, what we've found, and we really try to keep this going. And this is a really important part of keeping that culture that's going to keep this multi-generational effort alive. And lastly, we enjoy it. We have fun with each other. And if you didn't, you wouldn't do it. I definitely have fun, and that's why I'm still doing it. But we really just try to have fun, whatever we're doing. And I can say from my perspective, you know, it's just absolutely wonderful. I get to be outside all year round, out with flowers and living things all the time, and watching nature get better and better, and sharing all of that with people that are on the same team, pulling for the same, you know, going towards the same goal. And if that isn't a charmed life, I don't really know what is. So I'd like to thank the Northbrook Public Library and Jill especially. For organizing. And I'd be happy to take any questions if you have them. And I have to remember to repeat your questions, so.
Yeah. And we can go, we can go for about 5 more minutes and take a few questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
You had said earlier, I believe that the prairie, the Somme Prairie, was formerly a farm?
So the question is, was Somme Prairie a farm? And the answer is yes. Most of it was farmed. Parts of it were a radar installation at some point. But you know, farms weren't always kind of like what they look like today, especially back in the days. There used to be lots of nature surviving on the edges of farms in the days before herbicide. And so that's where these grade A prairies survived. It was on the edge in this kind of wetter spot that wasn't as good for agriculture. And so that's how the prairie survived. Well, actually, we don't really know how it survived to be so well, but it survived. It's kind of a miracle. Anyone else? Yes?
I thank you, first of all, great presentation, and thank you and all the volunteers for the great work. We always want to recruit more volunteers, and my question is, with limited resources, how do you think about allocating people time to these different quality areas? And I'm sure that's part of your learning community, but any brief thing you can say about that? I'm curious.
Sure. I would say that, well, you really, you have to inspire people to really take on this work. You don't just get into it if it's not inspirational. And the more inspired you are, the more you're going to give to it, and the better you're going to get, the more you're going to want to get better at it. And so if you kind of are working in these places that can inspire people, that are these high quality places, and they also tend to be the neediest ones. They need very specialized care. At Somme Prairie, we'll go out, just a few of us, and cut things that are less than the width of the pencil tongue, because we want to keep that little brush off the prairie. And you can't pay people. You can't just motivate people with swag to do that, right? They have to be inspired to do something like that. And that comes when you see a really beautiful nature, when you see these old growth places. And so for me, when I first walked at Somme Prairie Grove, it was like a religious experience, right? And I was just like, wow, this is like something I've never experienced before. And that's how you get people, the people that are going to give the most to come out and be inspired and participate. Yes?
Yeah, if I understood you correctly, essentially all that beautiful, wonderful flora that we see in the preserves now is seed that was drawn in from other local surviving remnant prairies, is that correct?
Yes. All of the species, the question is, are all the plants that we see at Somme from original populations, nearby populations? And the answer is yes. For all prairie species, I think almost all, they come from within 15 miles of Somme. For woodland and savanna species, because they're much rarer, they come from within 25 miles of Somme, and there's some very limited exceptions to that. But all of the genetic material is coming from within this very hyperlocal area. Yes?
And follow up to that, have you found any things in the preserves that you didn't knowingly bring in? In other words, were there any high quality things that got in there on their own, or from wildlife or the wind or whatever?
I haven't been around that one that I could tell you, over decades whether anything like that has happened. I do know that maybe Erica could speak to this a little bit more.
I think no.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Henrietta has a different little question that is like, can't they have survived in the seed bank?
The question is, can they have survived in the seed bank? And the answer is, there is no seed bank. That's the very, very short answer. These ecosystems, all of these grassland ecosystems, are characterized by not having a long-lived seed bank. And it doesn't pay off for these perennial species that come and flower year after year. It's the opposite for the weeds, right? The weeds want to have their seeds, and when they get a chance, they got to be ready to go. But the prairies, the conservative species that tend to be, long-lived, almost overwhelmingly, they don't want to have to start over every year. And so their seeds don't persist for very long, because they say, well, if it's not going to happen this year, it'll happen next year or in 10 years or wherever. So there, for the most part, there's no seed bank. To get back to your question, the only, one of the things that I can think of is that, along the edge of somewhere, someone planted side oats grandma, which is not a species that would have been found at Somme, probably. I've seen that blow around railroads. And things can come in like that, but I don't think there's anything at Somme that has come in just like that. Maybe another example would be, we did find a white-fringed orchid in Somme Woods one time. That probably got there by accident. We didn't plant that there. Probably came from across the street because of very fine dust-like seeds. So things can get around on people's feet and stuff like that, but overall, no, there hasn't really been a lot of things happening.